Welcome back. I hope you had a nice weekend, and we're starting out on Unit 5. 5 of 6. Holy cow. So, in spite of, or perhaps because of, the oppressive political context of the Cold War, major social upheavals reshaped everyday life in Europe and beyond in this period. In this unit, we will pay particular attention to social movements in Europe proper, so the gay rights movement, the student movement, and women's liberation, but also major movements that saw the dismantling of Europe's empires, specifically Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Portugal. In terms of thinking about empire in this period, I want you to be thinking about these questions. How did systems of race, gender, and class-based oppression, often invented and enforced by European occupation, shape the decolonization process? And how is this film, Wawa, a reflection of the decolonization processes? So that's what you should be thinking about as you watch Wawa. In addition to the decolonization of Europe's imperial holdings all across the world, Europe was experiencing various internal upheavals. You've read a short piece this week on how the symbol of Nazi persecution of homosexual prisoners, the pink triangle, was then adopted by gay rights activists in Europe and the US to combat the criminalization of same-sex desire. You've also listened to a podcast about sex strikes and where and how the idea of female emancipation and bodily autonomy, which were really 18th century ideas for Europeans, created the conditions then for 20th and 21st century sex strikes. The Pink Triangle blog post, of course, has more to do with the Consequence film, and the Sex Strikes podcast has more to do with the Girls film, but I wanted you all to have a sense of the subject matter of both contexts, even though you're only required to watch one of those films. Although if you want to watch both, more power to you. Central to both of these, of course, is the social and political activism of the 1960s. 1968 is usually discussed as the flashpoint moment of radical, usually young people shaking up the conservative miasma of European states. In that year, student groups all over the world, in Paris, in London, in Prague, in Tokyo, in New York, in Berkeley, in Warsaw, in Rome, right? In all of these places, students took to the streets, marching, protesting, getting in fights with the police over real and perceived oppression and censorship. And of course, the communist sentiments, those funded directly by the Soviet Union to subvert Western capitalism, and those that already existed in communities of young people who saw the exploitation inherent in a capitalist system, like second-generation migrants, thrived in the United Kingdom and Europe throughout the Cold War. Those groups were watched and censored, as they were here in the US, but also many of their concerns, like access to healthcare, fair housing, basic income needs, were actually addressed by the welfare states that came to dominate much of Western Europe in the 1960s and 70s, like the Swedish one that we talked about last week, or a couple weeks ago. Still, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, as Martin Luther King famously said, and young people were at the fore of fighting injustice. In 1968, often called the Year of the Barricades, student-led protests broke out all over the world. In February 1968, students went on strike at the Sorbonne in Paris. They demanded an end to visitation rules, which restricted who could be in the dorms and at what times of day and night. They also demanded control over course content and the selection of new faculty members. In the streets of Paris, students heaved Molotov cocktails at the police. Police beat students with billy clubs. Hundreds were injured, and several students died as a result of their injuries. Interestingly, 80% of the population of Paris supported the student protesters, who also joined workers striking that year against exploitative conditions in factories. On March 1st, 1968, in Rome, students were injured during a protest march. 19 of 33 Italian universities were affected by the riots, which broke out in response to the Rome March, and 23 buildings were occupied by students. The students demanded 1, control over their curriculum, 2, control over the selection of new professors, and 3, the student supervision of all grading. Why? Well, Of 60,000 students attending all the universities in Italy, there were only 300 faculty members. In other words, the student-to-faculty ratio was 1 to 200. Terrible. In March 1968, a student demonstration in Warsaw, Poland, led to riots in the streets. On March 13th, all Polish universities were out on strike. Between March 13th and 24th, there were more strikes, protests, and marches. University buildings were occupied by student protesters. On March 25th, Warsaw University fired 6 faculty members whose sympathies remained with the protesters. On the 28th, 3,000 students marched in protest to that decision. 34 of those students were expelled, 11 were suspended, and 200 were injured, and 11 academic departments were closed. And these are just 3 of these movements. These radicalized students went on to found gay and lesbian rights organizations, to challenge the oppressive nature of the gender regime, to write histories and political manifestos of the poor and working class, to fight racism and discrimination, and to, in a lot of ways, change the very fabric of their societies. Their efforts were also undermined and overturned by the conservative wave of politics that you'll read about in Chapter 10 for Mazauer. The liberation they achieved was, in some countries, too much for those in power to handle. Now I want to turn to the gay and lesbian rights movement in Europe in a brief sketch of women's liberation as further context for both the consequence and the girls. The effort to emancipate gay and lesbian people in Britain and Germany, as you may recall, built on the work of social scientists, activists, and politicians from earlier in the 20th century, particularly individuals like Magnus Hirschfeld, who you remember from our Weimar episode or lecture. He was a German sexologist who had to flee Berlin when the Nazis took over and burned down his Institute for Sex Research. And then over here we've got Havelock Ellis, who was an English sexologist who wrote about the innateness of same-sex desire and other minority sexualities. In 1957, the British government commissioned an inquiry into the policing of sex crimes. Their research found that hundreds of men were being imprisoned every year for having consensual sex with other men. They incorporated the latest social science, sexology, or the study of human sexual behavior, into their recommendations to the government, essentially arguing that this sexual activity was not learned, but inborn, and the government was essentially locking people up for private sexual behavior. It took a decade, but in 1967, Britain decriminalized same-sex sex for males over the age of 21. In places like France, technically, sex between men and between women had been legalized since the days of Napoleon in the 1790s. But the police employed a range of other public decency laws to harass homosexual men. According to Cole Stangler, in 1971, activists created the first organizations explicitly committed to the gay and lesbian cause in France, the Homosexual Front for Revolutionary Action, and the Red Dykes, itself an outgrowth of both the FHAR and the Women's Liberation Movement. Freshly politicized lesbians and gays, mostly students who'd been immersed in communist-inspired reading and activist groups, began to contemplate their own kind of suffering and exploitation. For them, eradicating discrimination against same-sex desire was incompatible with the existence of capitalism. They were not interested in influencing politicians. They were not interested in winning office. They saw themselves as laying the groundwork for a revolution in gender relations that would accompany the coming political revolt. Gay activism boiled down to a mix of newspapers, marches, and disruptive political events. FHAR co-founded Guy Hocheghem edited a special April 1971 edition of Tout, which means everything, devoted to homosexuality. In the pages of this newspaper, run by the short-lived anarcho-Maoist splinter group Vive la Révolution, or Long Live the Revolution, gay activists demanded free abortion and contraception, as well as the right to homosexuality and all sexualities. They broke up a live recording of a nationally broadcasted radio show devoted to the quote-unquote painful problem of homosexuality. They marched in the annual May 1st parade in Paris, some going in drag to provoke stodgy leaders of the French Communist Party and its closely linked trade union, the General Confederation of Labor. They held meetings at the School of Fine Arts in Paris, some of which degenerated into prolonged hookup sessions, and sometimes more than just that. At one such General Assembly, writers Daniel Guérin and François d'Albon are said to have stripped naked. These meetings were just as much group therapy sessions as political events, rare moments during which gays and lesbians could congregate, share their deepest anxieties, and dream of a better world. The women's rights movement is discussed by historians as having waves, right? This is reductive. European women have had to work constantly, individually, and in groups to challenge the patriarchy and the way that it seeks to control and subjugate women. Just like constant. Feminism as a concept has its roots in the 18th century, around the same time that male philosophers were fixating on ideas challenging the absolute authority of a single monarch and the inalienable rights of white men. Mary Wollstonecraft, who is here in the back, and Olympe de Gouges, right here, for example, were philosophers in the 18th century who wrote lengthy tracts about the importance of women's voices in the political realm, of their capability to be as brilliant and revolutionary as any man if they were only granted the same opportunities to education as their male counterparts. But for ease of historical narrative, we talk about predominantly white waves of women's rights activism. The first wave is attributed to the late 19th century women who advocated for women's right to vote all across Europe and the US, chafing against expectations that their role in society was motherhood and nothing else. Second wave feminism is attributed to the white middle-class women of the 1960s who advocated for bodily autonomy, redefinition of gender roles and expectations, and more than just lip service regarding gender equality. They tackled the pay gap between men and women, the double standard surrounding rape, sexual violence, and sexuality more broadly, abortion and birth control, and various social justice initiatives. And it often intersected with the gay and lesbian rights movements as suggested by the French example. Now, finally, social upheaval, right? Racism, as Mazar points out, was rampant in Europe. But it wasn't the same sort of racism that we see in the U.S. at the same time. Women of color from the West Indies, India, North Africa, East and West Africa came to Europe not as an enslaved population torn from their homes and forced to work for free on plantations. Instead, the majority of people of color started arriving from India, Jamaica, Barbados, Algeria, Senegal, Nigeria, Kenya, etc., as citizens of the empire, who had scraped enough money together to emigrate to London or Paris or Manchester to find a better life for themselves and their families. But the white people living in those places still had preconceived notions, stereotypes, and racist attitudes toward people with darker skin, different religions, accents, and different customs. While white British and French attitudes weren't predicated on centuries of very visible enslavement of dark-skinned peoples, their attitudes were based on centuries of internalized sense of superiority. They had colonized and dominated darker-skinned people, taking what they wanted with little regard for those people, and believed themselves better. But Western Europe's economy flipped so fast and expansively in the 1950s that they needed workers, again, like the Swedish example that we talked about a couple weeks ago. The industries like the new public transportation system, consumer production facilities, and more welcomed migrants from the Caribbean and India and beyond. Migrants who were, after 1953, technically British citizens, were met with derision, open hostility, and violence once they arrived in the UK. There was not enough housing for them, in part because the British government did nothing to accommodate the thousands who migrated each year, and in part because white landlords refused to rent to black tenants. People had to live in shanty towns in the slums of London and Paris. Those slums were also already occupied by poor and working class white people. And crowded together with pre-existing distrust, race riots broke out in these neighborhoods of London throughout the 1950s and 60s. Young people, often second-generation migrants, led movements to address the housing and other discriminations that people of color dealt with daily in Britain and France. So, as you read and listen this week, I want you to also be thinking about how the systems of gender, racial, and class-based oppression shaped the rights and liberation movements of the young and unruly in Europe. We'll talk about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. You'll get to choose a film, either The Girls, a Swedish feminist reinvention of the Greek classic Lysistrata, or you can watch The Consequence, which is a drama about the persecution of same-sex desiring men in Germany, where their persecution under Nazi rule was discounted because, in the eyes of post-war Germans, they were still criminals, regardless of their Holocaust suffering. I'd like you to divide these films somewhat equally among yourselves within your groups. So hopefully, like, half of the group will watch The Girls, half of your group will watch The Consequence, so that you can just sort of cover the main plot points in your presentations or in your discussions on Flipgrid, and sort of cross-pollinate your conversations. Declare your intentions earlier in the week in teams of which film you intend to watch. Put that into your group private chat channel so that the other folks in your groups can sort of divide equally. They're both great films, and I think that you will enjoy whichever one you end up watching, and maybe you'll watch both. Enjoy!